Welcome to this special episode of Amusing Jews in collaboration with the Jewish American Military Historical Society, a virtual museum found at jewishmilitary.org. I'm Jonathan Friedman.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes.
We're delighted to speak with Adrienne DeArmas, director of the Shapell Roster of Jewish Service in the American Civil War at the Shapell Manuscript Foundation, an independent educational organization dedicated to the research, collection, and exhibition of original manuscripts and historical documents. Adrienne, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
You manage a digital archive tracking military service files, pension records, letters, and diaries. How do you put together a soldier's profile?
Well, every soldier and sailor that we add to the Shapell roster must have evidence of Judaism and proof of service, so that's where we start. We have two types of names, names found by the Shapell roster researchers, and that's myself and two colleagues. And that includes names we find in the course of our research, names of ancestors given to us by descendants, and names discovered by other researchers that are shared with us. And then the second type is the names that came from Simon Wolf's The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. The difference between the two is if we can't find evidence that a name from Wolf was Jewish, or if we can't find their service, their names still stay in the roster just as a homage to the work that Simon Wolf did. For new names, we have to find proof that they were Jewish and evidence that they served, or else they don't get in. We enter all of the service information we can find, where and when they enlisted, whether they were drafted or volunteered, promotions, commissions, reductions, transfers, or detachments, if they were, WIA, KIA, or captured. We attach all the supporting documentation with citations so that anyone can find what we found. And lastly, we have a feature that I love called Soldier Connections, where we record which soldiers are related to each other and how. And I think this data tells us so much about the lived experiences of Jews in 19th century America. Tent mates become brothers-in-law after the war. Comrades become lifelong friends or business partners, and families torn apart as brother faced each other in battle, and so on. The important thing to remember is that not everyone left footprints in the historical record. That being said, I'm genuinely shocked at the number of photographs we have of these soldiers. We have over 150 photographic portraits in our database. And since you mentioned diaries, I am equally surprised at how few diaries we found from Jewish soldiers. There are 5 that we know of, and I have no idea why that number is so small.
Photography was a very new thing back then. Was it the case that people were just excited to take photos, or was this something that they always wanted to be able to document these things?
Photography came to America in 1839 when Louis Daguerre's technique. It is estimated that there were 3 million carte de visites, which were daguerreotypes, were taken during the Civil War. I think it was so new, and I think it was a matter of who had means. Like most things, So what the part that astounds me is that you go to any flea market and you're going to see tons of old, photographs, but they're not identified. The ones that we have, they're all identified, and some of them are, fairly, well known, at least in this very niche field, but. There's an example, and I'm going to talk about him later, this guy named Victor Ahrens, and a descendant reached out to us. They somehow found out about the Shapell roster, and they were like, this has been a blank in my genealogical research. I knew that he existed. I never knew what happened to him. And so they sent us a photograph, and they said, we could see that he was, in uniform, so we knew he enlisted. And so, and we were able to tell them, what happened to their ancestors. So that was pretty cool, that kind of merging our research and, descendants genealogy.
Do you work with genealogical societies and historical societies, that sort of thing?
We work with everybody. When we were first starting out, I identified three demographics for this project. And the first one that I wanted to secure were descendants, because that's the easiest way to find out if somebody was Jewish or not. And so we've done a really good job. We have partnered with the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies, and we've done presentations at their annual conference since 2015. And we absolutely work with the Jewish Gen community. In fact, you can access the Shapell roster from Jewish Gen. We did a partnership with them, so you can go to their site and then get to our site, or you can just go to us directly. But absolutely. And it's interesting because historians tend to frown on genealogical research. And I'm doing a conference at the National Council on Public History. They're doing a shared annual conference with the American Association of State and Local Histories. And I'm participating in a panel on basically why aren't historians using genealogical research? Because the depth of stories that you get from that. So yes, absolutely. We work with anybody and everybody.
And as someone who myself kind of straddles the line between the more amateur and professional historical approaches, I always find that the professional historians are pilfering the work that all the, hundreds of thousands of people are doing to put together the genealogical stuff.
Yes, yes, that does happen for sure. And the other side of that is, and I think this is where historians are skeptical, we call them leaf clickers on ancestry.com. And people are just like, oh, that's my ancestor. Oh, and they're not being as discerning as, say, we are. We just recently were researching a guy that we were really struggling to find evidence of his Judaism. And the reason is because there were lots of family trees on Ancestry. And yes, there was another man by the same name who was basically the same age, but it wasn't the guy who, Eugene Philip Jacobson, who was awarded the Medal of Honor. And so once we were able to figure out who his family was, then it was a slam dunk. It was very easy, but it was those leaf clickers who were like, oh, that's, my great great grandfather. And it's like, no, it's not that. Not to say that there wasn't another guy, right? And we run into that so often.
What did the Jewish population look like at the time of the Civil War? And how is that reflected in the ranks of both the Union and the Confederacy?
Nobody knows for sure, because the estimate that we have, which is approximately 150,000 Jews in the U.S. in 1860, is based off of a survey of synagogue seats. That's all we have. So that's what everybody uses. So using that, if correct, Jews made up 0.5% of the total U.S. population. Now we know that an estimated 3 million served in the Civil War. So our current statistics put Jewish service at 0.1%. So whether that will come up or not, we'll keep asking. But the bigger question that everybody usually asks is, did more Jews serve in the Union or the Confederacy? And as of right now, we have 1,845 Union soldiers in the database. That number could change tomorrow, because it frequently does. And 1,583 in the Confederacy. And I know for a fact that we have hundreds of names that we've been collecting over the last 15 years that we just haven't finalized the research and gotten them in the database. So, and I'll talk more about this later, but basically the experience of Jews in the American Civil War is the story of every American.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. Do you think the data compiled by the Shapell roster has helped to dismantle the myth that Jewish Americans didn't serve or sacrifice in the Civil War?
So our primary mission is to provide an accurate accounting of Jewish service in the Civil War. And I do believe that the Shapell roster does exactly that. For those who are interested in this, arguably a very, very niche field, I think the accuracy might be disappointing. Since 1895, when Simon Wolf published his roster, people have been saying that 10,000 Jews served in the war. I don't, we might get to 5,000, but I don't think we're ever going to see 10,000. And so, I mean, and I'll talk about this more later with the name profiling, but that's how we got his numbers. So I believe, and we know that, Simon Wolf is very clear. He created the roster in response to anti-Semitic rhetoric. And, I don't see a way to say that they didn't serve. I don't see a way to say that they didn't sacrifice. They served and sacrificed on par with every other American in the America at that time.
As you mentioned previously, identifying Jewish soldiers from the 1860s isn't as simple as finding Jewish-sounding names, which can be misleading, and religious affiliation wasn't standard on military intake forms. How do you determine who was Jewish?
This is the bread and butter of what we do. Name profiling is how Simon Wolf was able to claim that 8,116 Jews served in the Civil War. And then he said in his introduction that he knew he had missed names. So that's how it ended up getting rounded up to the 10,000. Our research, because not only do we need to find names that Simon Wolf missed, but we have to verify the names that he included. And so to date, 475 of those 8,000 plus names were duplicates. So that automatically takes us down into 7,000. Like, we have a guy who is listed 5 times in Wolf's roster, and it's a combination of Wolf didn't account for people serving in different state regiments. So this guy served in a New York regiment. He served in a New Jersey regiment. And then he didn't like the New Jersey regiment, so he deserted, and then he re-enlisted under a different name back in another New York, right? So, and the name he chose sounded Jewish. So yeah, Abraham Feeder was in the roster 5 different times, and we have consolidated him into one individual. And, if you think about trying to compile a roster, number one, 25 years after the Civil War, and without the internet, without, but we also think that Simon Wolf had early access to, he had a position with the DC government, which, was very tightly under the federal government. And we believe he had early access to the 1890 veteran census. We know of 2 names that he listed as being from Kentucky, and we found them living in Kentucky on an 1890 census, but their regiment was not identified. And we eventually found that they had served in Ohio regiment. So little clues like that, because we have no methodology from him. But anyway, back to, so out of his 7,600 names, we've already determined that 46 didn't serve. And that was either, they served in the Mexican-American War and he just didn't realize that, or they just didn't serve because they enlisted and then was like, oh no, I'm out, and never actually fulfilled their muster. But the real news out of it is almost 800 of these names not Jewish at all. In fact, there's a descendant of Benedict Arnold in Wolf's roster. Benedict Arnold was not Jewish. We're still trying to find evidence that almost 3,500 of the names were Jewish. So, and then we still have another 1,000 that we can't find service for. And as digitization continues, we hope that we'll be able to solve some of those mysteries eventually. In fact, I think I just solved one the other day where Wolf had him listed in this regiment, and no, not even close. He was over here. And we have examples where, and these are just typos, I think. when he was compiling the book, but we have 10 guys listed in an Illinois regiment. Couldn't find any of them, found all of them in a U.S. regular Army regiment with the same ordinal. So, I think that was just a typo. But let's talk about non-stereotypical Jewish sounding names for a minute. How about Jefferson? As in the descendants of former US President Thomas Jefferson. Other examples: Brown, Hendricks, House, Coconut, McBlair, Mosby, Ottolenghi, Satius, and my personal favorite, 3-foot. But the Shapell roster is very inclusive. And we break it down, and you can find this on our methodology on our website. We have 3 categories. The first one is genealogical proof, either matrilineal or patrilineal descent, and sometimes we go way back in the family tree. 19th century American Jews and 18th century American Jews also married outside of the faith for lots and lots of reasons. So just because they're not practicing, that, that doesn't really matter. We have a guy, he was I think he was a lieutenant colonel out of a Vermont regiment. We could not find any evidence that this guy was Jewish. We couldn't find his birth records. He married outside of the faith. He wasn't buried Jewish. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And there were multiple articles, newspaper clippings about his death. And one of them, only one of them, mentioned that his personal secretary came from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore and arranged for his body to be prepared before coming back to D.C. for burial. And I was like, huh. The name of the funeral parlor was Jacob Ahrens and Son. And it turns out that Jacob Ahrens and Son was the mortuary, the funeral home for the who's who of Baltimore Jews. So his personal secretary knew he was Jewish, and his personal secretary knew that he would want his body prepared for burial in Arlington National Cemetery according to Jewish tradition. So, it's just amazing, like the tiniest little thing. And we're like, okay, there it is. So we have genealogical proof. We also have self-identification. So let's say a soldier's applying for a pension, and one of the questions on the application is, are you married? And if so, when and where? And so he might respond that he was married by a rabbi in New York City in, 1858. And so that's that. Also, like, you'll see notices in a newspaper. So something about the local B'nai B'rith organization, and his name might be one of the signers of that missive. And so we're like, okay. Third category is testament by his contemporaries. And this is the guy I was telling you about, Victor Ahrens. One of our soldiers was discovered in the personal diary of a Civil War soldier named Thomas Francis Galway. Obviously, Galway is not Jewish, even though, I've read you the list of non-stereotypical names, we have to check. But out of the diary came the following quote: Jack Shepard's real name was Victor Ahrens. He was a full-blooded Jew. At 11 years of age, he had shipped out as a common sailor and had led a life of adventure until he enlisted with us in the summer of 1861. And we're like, that's so great, and then we found him, and then that's the story about how we connected with the descendant and was able to tell them what happened to somebody in their family tree. One caveat to the third category is if the nature of the testament by his contemporary is anti-Semitic, we keep digging. And the guy I was telling you about before, Jacobson, the only evidence we had was he was referred to as a I don't remember what it was, a derogatory term, but it was fairly mild. He was leaving a town in Mississippi and moving to Denver, and they were like, good riddance, and then some slur. And so we were like, okay, it's a hint, but we're not going with just that because, they could say that about anybody. So that's how we figure out people, and I can tell you, like, Odolengui, I was like, what? That sounds Italian to me, but it's basically Portuguese in origination, and so that's part of the whole immigration story.
I'm wondering in Wolf if you found any cases where he assumed that because the name was the same, it was just one person, but it actually ended up being two or three different people.
Exactly. And that's the case with Abraham Feeder. That's how that happened. Wolf also would Germanize a name. So a guy who went by Morris Levy, he might list his name as Moritz Levy. Again, I have nothing but respect for the amount of work, because he took out ads in newspapers all over the country and was like, send us your names, send us your names. And another interesting thing, because there's no question it was a propaganda publication. You know, he had an agenda, but we like to refer to him as a social justice warrior because, you know, his intentions were good. But there were just like the names that he has listed in the unclassified as to command. So here's an example. He lists a David Jones who served in a New York regiment. Well, there's 97 David Joneses that served in New York regiments, and we do not have the resources to research each and every one of them. What I can tell you is at that time, there was a David Jones who was a rabbi in Alabama. And sometimes I think Wolf went, okay, there's a guy named David Jones and there's a guy named David Jones, but he didn't list every David Jones in Alabama. So it's unclear what his methodology was, how reliable the names were. You know, I think sometimes people would send him lists of names and they were doing their own name profiling and he just went with it because it gave him numbers. But in Ohio, when you look at the count of names in Wolf, New York is the highest. Ohio is second. Well, Simon Wolf was from Cincinnati before he settled in DC. And I think he really wanted to make a case that his home state was, you know, but if you think about it, that didn't really make sense because the war never got to Ohio. The draft for the Union Army doesn't happen until 1863. And most of the guys who would have been eligible, they were working sometimes in the war effort, you know, in terms of like clothing trade. But it wouldn't have made sense for them to enlist in the numbers that he claims.
Are there any soldier profiles that you found particularly fascinating or surprising?
As I mentioned earlier, I'm shocked at how long some of these guys lived. I mean, we have many, many, many soldiers who lived to be well over 100. And when you think about the conditions during the Civil War were horrific. I mean, between disease and, you know, food shortages. I mean, we don't even need to talk about the fact that their diet was, you know, mostly pork. So you've got, you either eat or you die. So, you know, you've got all that going on. Anesthesia had not been invented. Doctors were typically former barbers or butchers, like they were good with a knife, right? And we've seen so many cases of PTSD, but it wasn't called PTSD. Back then it was called the horrors. And there was actually a question on pension applications, you know, like, have you experienced the horrors? Not a single soldier ever admitted to that. So we have zero statistics other than the fact that we have a lot of pension applicants. And you know, if a soldier doesn't apply for a pension, and obviously we're strictly talking about the Union Army for this discussion, if they didn't apply for a pension, then it's harder to find out what their life was like after the war. There are newspaper accounts, and you know there was a fair amount of domestic violence, alcoholism, suicide. I mean, pretty much what you would expect. It just wasn't recognized as such. But again, so how many people lived to be over 100? It was just amazing. I also alluded to there being descendants of Thomas Jefferson, who were Jewish. So it turns out that a son of Jefferson and Sally Hemings married the daughter of a Jewish businessman and his house slave. They decided to leave Virginia in the 1850s, and I can't remember whether this was I think this was a diary entry, but since it wasn't from a soldier, it's not part of the roster. But basically, what they wrote was they were trying to figure out where was the whitest place in the United States, and they decided that was Wisconsin. I don't think that was a bad call on their part. And so they moved there because then they could pass. And their two sons ended up becoming very high-ranking officers in the Union Army. And we have multiple stories about the genealogical heritage of some of these soldiers and how they have enslaved persons in their family tree. Another pair of brothers, Isaac and Israel Moses, from New York, Laura Liebman just wrote a book a couple of years ago about them, and their mother came from the West Indies, and she was the daughter of an enslaved person and their owner. So there's lots of stories of Jews and enslaved persons that will be coming out of the Shapell roster for sure. And one of my favorite stories, and I also mentioned this in the not typical Jewish names, we were convinced that we were looking at a Native American who had converted to Judaism, which, as you might imagine, we were very excited about. We were looking into this guy whose name was Michael Threefoot. He was buried in a Jewish cemetery. So we're looking into him and his family, and then we find he had a brother, Abraham Threefoot, who was married to a woman named Pocahontas. I am not making this up. This is on the 1860 census. So it turns out, after doing a lot of research, that the real Pocahontas in her family, they have a family tradition of the eldest daughter of each generation being named Pocahontas out of respect. Abraham and Michael Threefoot come to America from Germany, and they want to be Americans, so they Americanized their name. Threefoot is a literal translation of Dreyfus. That's literally what the word Dreyfus means, is, three-pronged or three-legged or whatever. So they went with Threefoot, and it was just crazy that, that was a somewhat sound, again, with the stereotypical naming. We were like, oh my God, that's a Native American. Look at his wife's name. No. And so that's one of my and they changed their names before they even set sail. So when they on their immigration records it says Abraham Threefoot and Michael Threefoot, and Jewish they were.
Do you have records of Jewish families split across the battle lines?
We do. The most prominent one of those is actually, you can find this story on Shapell.org. Abraham Lincoln had a very, very close friend named Abraham Jonas. And Jonas had 5 sons. It appeared that one of them served on both sides, but basically 4 of them served for the Confederacy and 1 served for the Union, which had to have been really embarrassing for Abraham Jonas and his close friend, Abraham Lincoln. But while there is no record that we know of confirming that 2 of his sons, Julian and Edward, came face to face at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, by cross-referencing regimental histories and each soldier's personal service history, it revealed that when Edward was captured during the battle, Julian's Crescent Regiment, and it was a heavy artillery, and so that was Julian's job, was to man the cannon, 460 feet away. Now, given all the smoke and, all of that, do we think that they saw each other? Probably not. But we don't know. But that's definitely one where we're like, yes, that happened. Another really cool story. There was a guy named Franz Lieber, obviously German, and he created what's known as the Lieber Code. He established this in 1863, and it establishes the first written rules for the conduct of armies in the field, and it laid the groundwork for modern international humanitarian law. He had two sons, one served for the Confederacy, the other one served for the Union. So, it kind of makes me wonder what his inspiration was for creating the Lieber Code and thinking about my own siblings and how when we get together, there's a little bit of mm-mm. So, and I think as we continue to research the Confederacy, I think we're going to find more and more of these stories. So, yeah, they're there.
Speaking of you, Adrienne, and your personal experiences, I'm wondering how you come to be a military historian. Did you have history in the military or just a, enthusiastic historian archivist?
So I have a very interesting background. I once had a job interview for the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., and she said, "Why should we hire you? You have no background in Victoriana, you don't have any background in DC history." And my reply to her was Indians, guns, and golf. And that was a reference to the subject matter that I have been a researcher and, created exhibitions and whatnot throughout my career. And I have long believed that subject experts, first of all, how can you be an expert when there's always something new to learn? But subject experts tend to forget that their audience doesn't know everything they know. So I've always been a big believer that coming to a topic with a lack of knowledge, but a lot of skills, can be very, very, very lucrative in terms of the stories that you can tell. And so my undergraduate degree is in anthropology. My master's degree is in museum studies. And I was actually working as a photo editor for AARP.org when this opportunity came up, and it was billed to me as a part-time gig. It was just supposed to be verify service for the names in Wolf. It was assumed that for the most part they were Jewish, that some might not be, but in general they were Jewish. And within the first month of working on this, we found a guy who was court-martialed for stealing a ham for personal use. I mean, it's one thing to eat what's put in front of you, but I'm like, I don't think so. And then there was this other guy, we were looking at his pension record, and his mother had written to the pension bureau saying that she needed, a pension because she relied on her son and he had been killed. And her obituary was included in the file, and she was identified as a good Christian woman. So I'm like, I think we actually need to research all these names in terms of Judaism. That kind of turned it into a full-time job. And so I was able to leave ARP. And then we started designing this database, and it was like, okay, we are building something huge here. We are building something that is more, I mean, it's concise in that, it's about Jews who served in the American Civil War. However, we do try to track as much information about their lives before, during, and after the war. So it's really a very valuable resource for academics who are interested in 19th century Jewish American life. It's about the skills, and it's about, knowing. I describe my research process as a big open field with tons of gopher holes. So you go down into one hole and you start exploring. And you have to be able to come up out of the hole that you went in and then go to the next hole and do the same thing. And it's, do you remember that game show in the 70s called Concentration? where they would flip the things and then you had to remember. That's what doing this kind of research is like. You have to like file away on your, little brain hard drive. Did I see something or I think something there. And then you move along and then you're like, wait, that thing. And then, so it's about skills. It's not, and I will be very honest, when I started, I I actually, even though I'm from the South and was raised on the War of Northern Aggression, I didn't actually know when the Civil War was. I mean, I had to look it up, and to this day, I don't have the start date and end date memorized. I knew nothing about military history, but thanks to lots of people who do, a very robust internet, it was pretty easy to pick that stuff up. So
Going from the beginnings to where you are now, and I think that was a very interesting imagery. Data collection is an ongoing journey. What are some areas your team is working on currently?
the Confederacy is hard. It's just hard. It's really hard because of the connections to slavery. It's exhausting because the documentation, if it exists at all, is very sparse. One of the things that the Confederacy did was they would list a soldier's last name and first initial. Okay, great. I's and J's look exactly the same. So we have a I or J Cohen, and in the historical record, we have so many Isaacs and Jacobs and Joshua's and and Johns and James even, So trying to figure out who is a lot, but we put it off as long as we could. We feel like we've basically done the Union, and so now we're working on the Confederacy in a concentrated way. And we've 2 years ago we published the Kentucky Confederate records. Last year we published the Confederate records from Louisiana. We are currently working on Georgia. It's a lot. It is a lot. But we hope to have Georgia finished, air quote, because I don't think we'll ever be finished with this, but have the bulk of the information. We hope to have that ready by October of this year. We have such a backlog of names to research because part of our research process is looking up, left, right, and down. So that means looking for siblings, cousins, uncles, grandfathers, some of our soldier connections I was telling you about. I mean, the text block is like that long because there's just, these three brothers had a total of 15 sons. And here are their sons that served. And here are the guys that their daughters married who met each other while they were serving. So it's a lot trying to untangle the family histories and so that will keep us busy for a while. My colleagues, Caitlin Winkler and Alexandra Pito, they just completed 2 presentations, one for the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, and that was on Jewish prisoners at Andersonville. And the second was for the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, and that was on Jewish soldiers from Louisiana. Author Adam Mendelson is wrapping up the second volume on Jewish soldiers in the Civil War for NYU Press, and he has been given access to the roster to help him write these books. The first one was on the Union Army, and it was published 3 years ago, and the second one's on the Confederate. In addition to the research I do, I have 2 academic conferences coming up. The one I already mentioned, and the other one is I put together a roundtable panel for the Southern Jewish Historical Society's annual conference. They're celebrating their 50-year anniversary. And so we're going to be talking about, how has the study of the topic Jews in the Civil War evolved over 50 years? And it's definitely gone from everybody was a hero, You know, lots and lots of famous and valiant and brave, individuals with no mention of the deserters and the, whatnot, to a more balanced approach as the centennial approached in the 1960s. More academics were like, hey, we don't need all of the mythology, all the glorification. Like, it happened, we served, and we showed up, we played ball. And so now I feel like this digital era that we are in, which we couldn't do. This would not exist if it wasn't for digitization. I mean, that's just a fact. The fact that we don't have to travel to every tiny archive and historical society and go through, finding aids that weren't designed to, call out what we're looking for. We would have never been able to do all of this. So we have that. I continue to work with descendants on getting their ancestors in the Shapell roster. Just put one in recently. It was difficult to nail down his service. We knew about him in that Verena Davis, in her memoir about the Civil War, Jefferson Davis's wife, she talks about Abraham Wheel and how he was a safe haven for them as they vacated Richmond, at the end of the war. And so I worked with his descendant, and we got him in the roster. And as he informed me, he was like, shoo, I'm 86. The actuary tables are not in my favor. And so we were able to help him out. But that is something that I love doing. So if anybody in your audience, has a ancestor who served in the Civil War, have them reach out to us at roster@shapell.org, because we want to make sure we include everybody.
Thanks for taking the time to talk with us, Adrienne.
Thank you so much for your interest. I really, really, really appreciate it. It's fun. And I love you guys' podcast. So great.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.